The elevator doors opened on the 40th floor, and my heart was already pounding before I took a single step. I had $11 in my bank account, and a stack of unpaid bills waiting for me at home, and none of that mattered right now, because I had exactly one shot at this interview, and I could not afford to waste it. The hallway was too quiet, no printers humming, no phones ringing, no chatter of coworkers gossiping near a coffee machine, just long black marble floors, and two men in dark suits, standing outside a set of double doors, like statues carved from stone. I told myself it was a private security firm, just like the job posting said, and private security firms probably needed serious men standing around looking serious. That was their whole job, nothing strange about it. I straightened my blazer, the only one I owned, and walked toward the doors. One of the men held up a hand before I even reached them. "Name," he said. "Elena Voss," I answered. "I have an interview at 10. He looked at a tablet in his hand for a long moment, longer than it should have taken to confirm one name on one list, and then he nodded once and stepped aside. The other man opened the door for me without a word. The office inside was nothing like I expected from a security firm. It looked more like something out of a magazine, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the entire city, a massive desk made of dark wood, and behind that desk, a man who did not look up when I entered. He was writing something, unhurried, like my presence meant nothing to him yet. "Sit down," he said, without lifting his head. I sat. For a moment there was nothing but the sound of his pen against paper and the distant hum of the city 40 floors below us. I used that moment to study him, because I have always believed you can learn more about a person by watching them than by listening to them. He was younger than I expected, for someone who ran an entire floor of a building like this, maybe early 30s, with dark hair cut close, and a jaw that looked like it had never once relaxed. His shirt was crisp white, no tie, sleeves rolled to the elbow, and there was a thin white scar cutting across his left knuckles that made me wonder what kind of security work left a mark like that. He finally looked up. His eyes were a pale gray, almost colorless, and they moved over me the way someone examines a document, searching for details rather than admiring a face. "You're Elena Voss," he said. It was not a question. "That's right," I said. "Thank you for seeing me, Mr. Kessler." "Damon," he corrected. "Mr. Kessler is my father, and he's been dead for 11 years. I did not know how to respond to that, so I said nothing, which turned out to be the right instinct because he almost smiled, just a small twitch at the corner of his mouth before it vanished again. "Your resume says you worked in logistics for 3 years, he said, glancing at a folder on his desk that I had not seen him open. Then a gap. Almost 8 months with no employment listed. I felt my spine straighten. I had rehearsed an answer to this exact question a dozen times in front of my bathroom mirror, but hearing it asked by a man like this made my prepared words feel thin and inadequate. "My mother was sick," I said. "I stayed home to take care of her until she passed. I started looking for work again as soon as I could." He studied me without blinking, and for a moment, I thought he might ask something cruel, something about why family should not interfere with a career, the kind of thing men in his position sometimes said when they wanted to remind you who held the power in the room. Instead, he simply nodded once, slow and deliberate, like he was filing the information away somewhere private. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said, and strangely, it did not sound like the empty courtesy people usually offered. It sounded like he meant it, like loss was something he understood far too well himself. We continued through the interview, and I answered his questions as clearly as I could, questions about organization, about discretion, about my ability to keep sensitive information private. Every question circled back to the same theme: trust, confidentiality, loyalty, as if the position I was applying for required more silence than skill. I told myself again that this was normal for a security company handling wealthy clients. I told myself a lot of things that morning to keep my nerves steady. Then, reaching for a pen inside my bag to note down a detail he mentioned about the role, my elbow caught the edge of the bag, and it tipped over on my lap. A small avalanche of items spilled across my knees and onto the polished floor in front of his desk: my wallet, a tube of lip balm, a folded grocery list, and an old photograph that had lived in the inside pocket of my bag for as long as I could remember. I dropped to my knees immediately, cheeks burning with embarrassment, scrambling to gather everything before he could see how disorganized my life actually was underneath the blazer and the rehearsed answers. "Let me help," he said, and before I could stop him, he had already leaned down and picked up the photograph that had slid the farthest, landing near the leg of his desk. I reached for it, ready to apologize for the mess, ready to laugh it off and move on with the interview. But he did not hand it back. He was staring at it, really staring, the way a person stares at something impossible, something that should not exist in the world they thought they understood. His jaw, already tight, went rigid enough that I could see a small muscle jump along the side of his face. His breathing changed, slower, deliberate, the kind of control a person forces onto themselves when something inside them wants to break loose. "Mr. Kessler," I said carefully, "Damon, is something wrong?" He did not answer right away. His thumb moved across the surface of the photograph, an old faded picture of a woman standing beside a lake, sunlight caught in her dark hair, a soft smile on her face that had always made me feel calm whenever I looked at it, even though I never knew who she was. My mother had kept that photograph hidden inside a small wooden box for my entire childhood, and she had never once told me the woman's name, only that I should keep it safe and never show it to anyone outside our family. I had broken that rule the moment it slipped out of my bag onto his floor. "Where did you get this?" he asked, and his voice had changed completely. Gone was the calm, controlled tone from moments earlier. What replaced it was something rawer, something that sounded almost afraid, though I could not imagine a man like him being afraid of anything. "It was my mother's," I said carefully. "I found it in her things after she passed. I don't know who the woman is. My mother never told me." He looked up from the photograph and met my eyes, and for the first time since I had walked into that office, I saw something behind his cold gray stare that looked entirely human, something fractured and desperate and old. "That's impossible," he said quietly, almost to himself. "This isn't possible." "Mr. Kessler," I said again, standing slowly, unsure whether to reach for the photograph or step back entirely. "What is it? What's wrong?" He set the photograph down on his desk, with a care that seemed strange for a man who ran his office like a fortress, like it might shatter if he moved too quickly. Then he stood, walked to the window, and stared out over the city with his back to me, hands pressed flat against the glass. "I think this interview is over," he said finally, his voice tight and controlled once more, though I could still hear the tremor buried beneath it. "Someone will contact you." I did not understand. I had answered every question. I had shown up on time, dressed appropriately, spoken clearly and honestly. The only thing that had changed in the entire room was a single old photograph, and I had no idea why a picture of a stranger by a lake could turn a man like Damon Kessler into someone who looked like he had just seen a ghost. I gathered my things from the floor, my hands shaking slightly, though I tried to hide it, and I reached for the photograph on his desk. He caught my wrist before I could pick it up. His grip was not rough, but it was firm, deliberate, the grip of a man who was used to controlling every situation around him, and had just lost control of one for the first time in years. "Can I keep this?" he asked. "Just for a day. I'll return it." I looked at his hand around my wrist, then at his face, searching for some explanation in his expression, and finding only a storm he was working hard to contain. "Why?" I asked. "Who is she to you?" He let go of my wrist slowly, and for a long moment he said nothing at all, staring at the photograph like it might disappear if he blinked. "I don't know yet," he said, "but I intend to find out." I left his office that day without a job offer, without an explanation, and without the one photograph that had connected me to a mother I barely understood. I rode the elevator down 40 floors in silence, replaying every second of the interview in my mind, trying to make sense of a man whose entire world had cracked open because of a stranger in an old photograph. I told myself I would never hear from that company again. I was wrong. 2 days later, my phone rang with a number I did not recognize, and a calm female voice on the other end told me I had been selected for the position, starting immediately, with a salary nearly triple what the original posting had promised. I should have asked more questions before I said yes. I did not, because desperation has a way of silencing every sensible voice in your head. I thought about my empty refrigerator, the final notice sitting unopened on my kitchen counter, and the small storage unit where the rest of my mother's belongings sat waiting for a payment I could not currently make. A salary like the one offered would solve all of it within a month. I told the woman on the phone yes before she had even finished explaining the benefits, and I hung up feeling a strange mixture of relief and unease that refused to settle no matter how many times I told myself I had simply gotten lucky. That night, I sat on the floor of my apartment with the small wooden box that used to hold the photograph, now empty, running my fingers along its worn edges. My mother had carried that box through 3 different homes and 2 difficult marriages, and she had never once let me ask about the woman inside it. Whenever I brought it up as a child, her face would close like a door slamming shut, and she would change the subject so quickly that I eventually learned to stop asking altogether. Now a stranger in a glass office 40 floors above the city held that photograph, staring at it like it explained something he had spent his entire life trying to understand. I wondered what he had seen in that woman's face that I had never noticed, growing up beside that same photograph my entire childhood. I wondered what secret my quiet, careful mother had been protecting all those years. I did not know yet that the answer would take everything I thought I understood about my own family and turn it inside out. I only knew that I needed the job, and that whatever waited for me on the 40th floor, I was walking straight into it with my eyes wide open and my questions still unanswered. The photograph sat on my desk for 3 days before I let anyone else see it, and even then, I only showed it to Nolan, the one man in my organization I still trusted completely. Nolan had worked beside me since before I took control of everything my father left behind, and he had earned the right to ask questions that other men would never dare speak out loud. When I slid the photograph across my desk toward him that morning, he picked it up, studied it for a long moment, and then looked at me with an expression I rarely saw on his face. "That's her," he said quietly. "That's your mother." "I know," I said. "Where did it come from?" "A woman who came in for an interview," I said. "Elena Voss. She said it belonged to her own mother." Nolan set the photograph down carefully, like it might burn him if he held it too long. "Your mother disappeared 26 years ago, Damon. Nobody has seen a photograph of her since before that night. How does a stranger's mother end up with one?" That was the exact question that had kept me awake for 3 straight nights, staring at my ceiling while the city hummed quietly outside my window. My mother vanished when I was 6 years old, taken from our home during a betrayal so complete that it reshaped the entire structure of the organization my father ran, and eventually the one I inherited from him. I grew up being told different versions of what happened to her, depending on who was speaking, and how much they thought I could handle hearing. Some said she left willingly. Some said she was taken as punishment for a debt my father refused to pay. One man, long dead now, once told me she had simply run from a life she never wanted, though I never believed that version. Not once. What I did know was this. My father spent the rest of his life searching for her, spending money and resources that should have gone toward protecting the empire he built, and he died without ever finding an answer. He passed that same unfinished search on to me, the way other men pass down a house or a business, an inheritance made entirely of unanswered questions. And now a stranger had walked into my office carrying a photograph that should not exist anywhere outside of my own private collection, hidden inside a locked drawer that only I had access to. "I want her followed," I said to Nolan, quietly. "I want to know everything about her life before she sets foot in this building again." Nolan studied me carefully, the way he always did when he suspected I was making a decision driven by something other than logic. "You're going to hire her." "I'm going to find out the truth," I said. "Hiring her is simply the fastest way to keep her close enough to watch." He did not argue, though I could tell he wanted to. Nolan had never approved of decisions built on emotion rather than strategy, and he was right to be cautious, because everything about this situation felt like emotion wearing the mask of strategy. I told myself I only wanted answers about my mother. I told myself Elena Voss meant nothing to me beyond the information she might unknowingly carry. I repeated that lie to myself so many times over the following 2 days that I nearly believed it. The report Nolan brought back told me very little that surprised me, and everything that mattered. Elena Voss, 26 years old, raised by a single mother who worked as a seamstress until her death, 8 months earlier from a long illness. No father listed on any documentation Nolan could find. No siblings, no criminal record, no ties to any organization remotely connected to mine. She had worked an ordinary logistics job for 3 years before losing her position during a round of layoffs, and she had been searching for work ever since, falling further behind on rent with each passing month. Nothing about her life suggested any connection to the world my mother had vanished from. Nothing except the photograph, which made the mystery deeper rather than simpler. Her mother's name, I asked. What was it? Marianne Voss, Nolan said. Nothing about the name meant anything to me, though I turned it over in my mind for hours, searching my memory for any mention of it from my childhood, any conversation overheard through a closed door, any name whispered by men who thought I was too young to understand what they discussed. I found nothing. I called Elena myself instead of leaving the offer to my assistant, though I disguised my voice enough that she would not recognize me on the phone. I told myself this was simply thoroughness, ensuring the job offer reached her clearly and without confusion. I did not examine too closely why I wanted to hear her accept the position with my own ears, rather than reading about it in a report the next morning. She said yes almost immediately, her voice tight, with something that sounded like relief, mixed with exhaustion, the voice of someone who had been holding her breath for a very long time, and had finally been allowed to release it. I hung up the phone afterward and sat in my office for a long time, staring at the photograph still resting inside my desk drawer, wondering what I had just set into motion. My mother's face looked back at me from that old photograph exactly the way I remembered her from childhood, though the memories themselves had grown thin and uncertain over the years, more feeling than image. I remembered her laugh more clearly than her face. I remembered the particular way she used to hum while she worked in the kitchen of the house I grew up in, a small tuneless melody that meant nothing to anyone but her. I remembered the night she disappeared far more sharply than I remembered anything about her that came before it, because that night had been carved into me with a violence that refused to fade. I was 6 years old, hiding beneath my bed because my father had told me to stay quiet, no matter what I heard. I heard raised voices downstairs, my mother's voice among them, frightened in a way I had never heard before. I heard footsteps, a door slamming, a car engine starting somewhere outside. By the time my father came to pull me out from under the bed, my mother was gone, and she never came back. For years I believed my father would find her. I believed it with the total, unquestioning faith only a child possesses, even as the men around me began speaking of her in the past tense, even as my father's search grew quieter and more desperate with each passing year, until it stopped altogether, replaced by silence neither of us ever broke. Now, decades later, a woman walked into my office carrying my mother's photograph inside her purse, like it was nothing more than a family memento, and I could not decide whether I had finally found the beginning of an answer, or whether I had simply invented a connection out of desperation, the same desperation that had consumed my father until the day he died. Elena started working on our floor the following Monday. I watched her from my office window as she arrived that first morning, dressed carefully in clothes that looked slightly too formal for the position she believed she had been hired for, her shoulders squared with the particular determination of someone who had decided to succeed, no matter what obstacles stood in her way. She did not look up at my window. She had no reason to know I was watching. I told myself I would observe her from a careful distance, gathering whatever information her presence might eventually reveal, without allowing myself to become distracted by anything beyond the mystery of the photograph itself. I told myself this arrangement was simple, controlled, entirely within my ability to manage. I broke that promise to myself within the first week. There was something about the way Elena carried herself through the office that pulled my attention away from every report on my desk, every call I was supposed to be taking, every meeting I found myself distracted through. She asked sharp, intelligent questions during her orientation. She treated the guards stationed throughout the floor with the same simple courtesy she showed everyone else, unaware or unbothered by the fact that most people in this building either feared those men or avoided them entirely. She worked quickly, efficiently, without complaint, even when the tasks given to her were designed primarily to keep her occupied while Nolan's men continued their quiet investigation into her background. By the end of that first week, I had learned nothing new about the photograph or my mother's disappearance. I had learned considerably more about Elena Voss than I intended to, and none of it explained why I found myself inventing reasons to walk past her desk more often than any reasonable schedule required. Nolan noticed, of course. Nolan noticed everything. "You're spending a great deal of time observing someone who is supposedly just a lead in an investigation," he said one evening, standing in the doorway of my office while I pretended to review documents I had already read twice. "I'm being thorough," I said. He did not look convinced, and honestly, neither was I. Something about Elena Voss had shifted from a puzzle I needed to solve into a presence I found myself wanting near me, and that shift terrified me more than any threat my organization had faced in years. Men in my position could not afford distractions. Men in my position could not afford to care about anyone beyond the narrow circle required to keep the entire structure standing. Yet every evening, after the office emptied and the building grew quiet, I found myself opening that desk drawer, staring at the photograph of my mother beside the lake, and thinking not only of the mystery she represented, but of the woman whose eyes had looked so much like hers when she picked herself up off my office floor and demanded to know what was wrong. I did not have an answer for her that day. I was beginning to fear I would not have a simple answer for much longer, because the deeper Nolan's investigation went, the more the threads connecting Elena's family to my own seemed to multiply rather than resolve, each new detail raising 3 additional questions for every one it managed to answer. Somewhere beneath the surface of this city, in records long buried and memories long silenced, the truth about my mother's disappearance waited. I could feel it, the same way I had felt danger approaching my entire life, an instinct sharpened by necessity until it rarely failed me. I did not yet know that the truth, when it finally surfaced, would not simply answer the question of what happened to my mother. It would threaten to unravel the very foundation my father built our entire world upon, and it would place Elena Voss directly in the path of enemies neither of us yet knew existed. On the 9th day, I finally allowed myself to speak with her directly, rather than watching from a distance and inventing reasons afterward. I found her alone in the small break room on our floor, standing at the window with a cup of coffee she had not yet touched, staring out at the city the same way I often did from my own office. She turned when she heard my footsteps, and for a brief moment, I watched her expression shift from surprise to something more guarded, the same careful caution I remembered from the day of her interview. "Mr. Kessler," she said. "Damon," I reminded her. She offered a small, uncertain smile, the kind of smile people give when they are not entirely sure whether they are in trouble. "I wanted to thank you," she said, "for the opportunity. I know I probably should have asked more questions before accepting, but I needed the position badly enough that I didn't let myself think too hard about it." That kind of honesty was rare in my building, where most people chose their words carefully around me, weighing every sentence for how it might be received. I found myself drawn to it more than I expected. "You don't need to thank me," I said. "You earned the position through the interview itself. The rest was simply paperwork." She studied me for a moment, and I could see the question forming behind her eyes before she spoke it aloud. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "About the photograph." My chest tightened, but I kept my expression steady, the same careful control I had spent years perfecting. "Go ahead." "Who is she to you?" Elena asked. "You looked at that photograph like you'd seen a ghost. I've thought about it every day since I left your office that first time, and I still don't understand what happened." I set my coffee cup down on the counter beside me, buying myself a few seconds to decide how much truth to offer her. Part of me wanted to tell her everything immediately, to lay out the entire history of my mother's disappearance, and ask her directly what she knew about the connection between our families. Another part of me, the part shaped by decades of caution and calculated silence, warned me against revealing too much before I understood exactly what I was dealing with. "She might be someone I lost a long time ago," I said finally. "Someone my family never stopped looking for." Elena's eyes widened slightly. "Your mother," she said quietly, not quite a question. I did not confirm it directly, though my silence probably answered clearly enough. "I'm still trying to understand how your family came to have that photograph," I said instead. "It matters more than you probably realize." She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup, though she still did not drink from it. "My mother never told me anything about it. she said. I used to ask when I was young, and she would shut the conversation down so completely that I eventually stopped trying. I always assumed the woman in the photograph was some relative from a part of the family we never talked about. I never imagined it might belong to someone else's family entirely. Perhaps it belongs to both, I said. She looked at me carefully then, studying my face the way she had studied the entire room during her interview, searching for details rather than simply accepting what she was told. Is that why you hired me? She asked. Because of the photograph, not because of anything I said during the interview. I could have lied to her in that moment. Lying would have been easier, safer, more consistent with the way I handled every other relationship inside my organization. Instead, standing in that quiet break room with the city stretching out gray and distant beyond the window, I told her the truth. Partly, I admitted, I won't pretend otherwise, but you've proven yourself capable enough these past 9 days that I no longer think of you only as a link to my mother's past. I think of you as someone worth having in this building, regardless of what we eventually discover. Something shifted in her expression, a softening around eyes that had been guarded since the moment she walked into my office. I appreciate you telling me the truth, she said. Most people in your position wouldn't have bothered. Most people in my position have very good reasons for avoiding the truth, I said. I'm beginning to think I've made an exception for you. She did not respond immediately, and the silence between us stretched into something that felt heavier than simple conversation, charged with questions neither of us was ready to ask directly. Eventually, she picked up her coffee and took a sip, breaking whatever tension had built in the space between us. I hope we find the answer, she said quietly. Whatever it turns out to be. So do I told her, though privately, I had already begun to suspect that whatever answer waited for us would not arrive gently, and that the deeper we searched into the truth behind that photograph, the more dangerous the ground beneath both of us would become. Gunfire is not the sound most people imagine before they hear it for the first time up close, and I learned that lesson on a Tuesday afternoon while carrying a stack of files down a hallway I had walked 100 times without a single moment of concern. The sound came from the parking garage beneath the building, sharp cracks that echoed strangely through the concrete structure, followed immediately by shouting and the screech of tires against pavement. Every guard on our floor moved at once, radios crackling with clipped instructions I could not follow, and within seconds, someone had grabbed my arm and pulled me down behind the reception desk with a firmness that left bruises I would find later that night. Stay down, the guard said, a young man named Callum whose face I had barely registered before that moment. Do not move until someone tells you it's clear. I stayed down, my heart slamming against my ribs so hard I could feel it in my throat, listening to chaos unfold somewhere below us, that I could not see, and desperately hoped would not reach the 40th floor. I thought about the ordinary logistics job I used to complain about, the quiet, boring days filled with spreadsheets and shipping schedules, and I wondered how I had ended up crouched behind a marble desk, while gunfire echoed through the building beneath my feet. It took nearly 20 minutes before Callum finally allowed me to stand, and by then Damon had appeared at the end of the hallway, moving with a controlled urgency that made him look entirely different from the calm, careful man I had spoken with in the break room days earlier. His jaw was tight, his eyes sharp and alert in a way that reminded me uncomfortably of the guards who watched the entrance every morning. Elena, he said, crossing the distance between us quickly. Are you hurt? I'm fine, I managed, though my voice shook more than I wanted it to. What happened? Was someone hurt? One of my drivers, he said, his expression darkening. He'll survive. This was a message, not an accident. A message, I repeated. From who? He hesitated, and in that hesitation, I understood something I had been avoiding admitting to myself since my very first day in this building. Damon Kessler did not run a private security company. Whatever business occupied this floor, and the men who guarded it so carefully, it was not the kind of business that appeared on any legitimate registry, and the danger surrounding it was not theoretical. Come with me, he said, instead of answering directly, and I followed him into his office, because I did not know what else to do, my legs still trembling slightly from adrenaline that had nowhere left to go. He closed the door behind us and turned to face me, and for the first time since I had known him, he looked uncertain, like a man deciding how much honesty a fragile situation could bear. I think it's time I told you the truth about what this organization actually does, he said. I already suspected, I said quietly. I'm not foolish, Damon. Ordinary security companies don't have gunfire in their parking garages. He exhaled slowly and gestured for me to sit, then settled into the chair across from me instead of retreating behind his desk, a small gesture that somehow made the coming conversation feel less like an interrogation and more like an admission between equals. My family has controlled certain interests in this city for 3 generations, he said. Interests that operate outside the boundaries most people consider legal. I inherited this position from my father, who inherited it from his father before him. It is not something I am proud of, but it is something I cannot simply walk away from, not without endangering everyone who depends on the stability I maintain. I sat very still, processing the weight of what he was telling me, the pieces of the past 2 weeks rearranging themselves into a picture far more dangerous than I had allowed myself to imagine. The guards, the silence, the strange formality of everyone around me, the enormous salary offered for a position that seemed to require very little actual work. It all made a terrible kind of sense now. And the man who was shot today, I asked, was that because of you? Because of a rival organization testing whether my grip on this territory has weakened since my father died, he said. These conflicts happen periodically. Usually they are handled quietly, before they ever reach a level that puts civilians at risk. Today, someone made a choice that put people in danger who should never have been exposed to any of this. People like me, I said. He met my eyes directly. Yes, I should have been angrier than I was, should have demanded to know why he had brought me into a world this dangerous without a single word of warning, why he had let me walk through that lobby every morning, believing I worked somewhere ordinary. Instead, sitting across from him, with my hands still trembling slightly, I found myself thinking not of anger, but of the photograph, of the strange, tangled connection between our families that had pulled me into this building in the first place. Does this have something to do with your mother? I asked. Whatever happened to her all those years ago? Is that connected to what happened today? Something shifted behind his eyes. A flicker of surprise followed quickly by something more careful. I don't know yet, he admitted, but I intend to find out, and I no longer think it's safe for you to remain uninformed while I search for the answer. Over the following hour, he told me more than he probably intended to, pieces of a history I had never imagined myself connected to. His mother's disappearance 26 years earlier, the betrayal that reshaped his father's entire organization, the enemies who had circled the family ever since, waiting for a moment of weakness to reclaim territory and influence lost during that original conflict. He spoke carefully, measuring each detail before releasing it, but I could see how much effort it cost him to share a history he had clearly spent years protecting from outsiders. Why are you telling me all of this? I asked when he finally paused. You barely know me. He was quiet for a long moment, studying me with an expression I could not quite read. Because you're already involved, whether either of us intended it, he said. Your mother had a photograph that should not exist outside my family's private records. Someone in this city knows something about the connection between our families, and today's attack tells me that whoever it is may not want that connection uncovered. The realization settled over me slowly, cold and unwelcome. You think I'm in danger, I said. I think it would be foolish to assume otherwise, he said. Before I went home that day, I asked Damon one more question that had been sitting heavy in my chest since the moment he mentioned the rival organization testing his authority. Do you know who ordered the attack? I asked. He hesitated, and that hesitation told me more than any answer could have. There's a man named Grantham, he said finally. He ran a rival territory alongside my father for many years, an uneasy peace that mostly held until my father died. Since then, he's tested my boundaries more than once, always carefully enough to avoid direct accusation. Today felt bolder than his usual approach, which concerns me more than the attack itself. Why would he grow bolder now? I asked. Because he may believe I'm distracted, Damon said, his eyes finding mine in a way that made the meaning behind his words unmistakable. Because he may have noticed changes in how I operate this office over the past 2 weeks, and decided to test whether those changes have made me weaker. The weight of that statement settled over me slowly. You think I'm the distraction, I said. "I think you've changed something in me that men like Grantham are trained to notice," he said quietly. "Whether that makes me weaker remains to be seen. I intend to prove it does not." I left the office that evening with Priya, walking a careful step behind me, my mind turning over everything Damon had revealed, searching for some thread that might connect a man named Grantham to a photograph of a woman beside a lake. Nothing fit together cleanly yet, but I had begun to sense a shape forming somewhere beneath the surface of everything happening around me, a shape I was not yet able to name. At home that night, I pulled out the small wooden box that used to hold the photograph and searched through the remaining contents more carefully than I ever had before. Beneath a false bottom I had never noticed in 26 years of handling that box, I found a folded piece of paper, brittle with age, covered in my mother's careful handwriting. It was not a letter exactly, more a list of dates and initials that meant nothing to me on their own, though one set of initials appeared 3 separate times throughout the page. DG. I stared at those initials for a long time, wondering whether they might belong to the same Grantham that Damon had mentioned only hours earlier, wondering what my quiet, careful mother could possibly have known about a man connected to organized violence in a city she had always claimed to have no ties to, beyond the small apartment where she raised me alone. I photographed the page with my phone before returning it carefully to its hiding place, uncertain yet whether I wanted to share this discovery with Damon or hold it privately a little longer, turning it over in my own mind until I understood what it might mean. Something told me that once I showed him this piece of paper, there would be no returning to the careful distance either of us had been pretending to maintain since the moment his mother's photograph fell out of my bag. That night, I could not sleep, replaying every detail of the conversation in my mind, the sound of gunfire still echoing somewhere at the edge of my thoughts every time I closed my eyes. I thought about my mother, quiet and careful my entire childhood, guarding a secret she never once explained, and I wondered what she would think if she could see where that secret had eventually led me. I considered quitting. I sat at my small kitchen table with a resignation letter half written on a scrap of paper, weighing the terror of what I had witnessed against the desperate need for the salary that had finally allowed me to pay off my mother's medical debts and keep a roof over my head. Fear told me to walk away and never look back. Something else, something harder to name, told me that walking away now would mean abandoning the only chance I might ever have of understanding the woman in that photograph, and understanding the strange, complicated pull I felt toward the man who had looked at her image like his entire world had cracked open. I did not send the resignation letter. The following morning, I returned to the office as usual, though everything about the building felt different now that I understood what truly operated beneath its polished surface. The guards no longer looked simply cautious to me. They looked necessary, a visible reminder of exactly how much danger surrounded the man I worked for, and by extension, surrounded me as well. Damon found me shortly after I arrived, his expression softening slightly when he saw me at my desk. "You came back," he said, something like relief threading through his voice. "I have questions that need answers," I said. Walking away wouldn't have given me any of them. He studied me for a long moment, and I saw something shift in his expression, a kind of respect that had not been there before, mixed with something warmer that neither of us acknowledged directly. "I want you to have additional protection from now on," he said. "Someone assigned specifically to you, in case yesterday was only the beginning of something larger." I did not argue, though the idea of needing personal protection still felt surreal, like something from a film rather than my own ordinary life. Over the following days, a quiet, serious woman named Priya became a near constant presence beside me, escorting me between the office and my apartment, watching entrances and exits with the same careful vigilance the other guards showed toward Damon himself. I grew used to her presence faster than I expected, grateful for the safety, even as I mourned the ordinary life I had once complained about so often. Nolan, the man I had come to understand, was Damon's closest and most trusted advisor, approached my desk one afternoon while Damon was occupied in a meeting down the hall. He studied me for a long moment before speaking, his expression unreadable. "You should know something," he said quietly. "Damon has not spoken about his mother this openly with anyone in years, not even with me. Whatever you represent to him, it matters more than you probably realize." I don't fully understand what I represent, I admitted. I'm still trying to piece together how my mother ended up connected to any of this. Nolan glanced toward the hallway where Damon's voice could be heard faintly through a closed door, then back at me. Be careful with him, he said. Not because he would hurt you, because I've watched that man build walls around himself for over a decade, and I've never once seen anyone get past them the way you seem to be managing, without even trying. I did not know how to respond to that, so I simply nodded, filing his words away, alongside everything else I had learned over the past 2 exhausting weeks. That evening, working late to finish a report Damon needed for an early meeting, I found myself alone in the office, long after most of the staff had gone home. The building felt different in the quiet hours, shadows stretching longer across the marble floors, the distant hum of the city outside replaced by an unsettling stillness inside. I told myself I was simply tired, that the unease crawling along my spine was nothing more than lingering nerves from the attack 2 days earlier. Then I heard footsteps in the hallway outside the break room, slow and deliberate, entirely unlike the confident stride of the guards I had grown accustomed to hearing throughout the day. I froze, my hand hovering over my phone, uncertain whether to call for Priya or simply wait to see who appeared. The footsteps stopped just outside the door, and for several long seconds, nothing happened at all, only silence, stretching taut enough that I could hear my own pulse hammering in my ears. Then the door opened, and Damon stepped through, his expression immediately shifting to concern when he saw how pale I had gone. "Elena," he said, "what's wrong?" I let out a breath I had not realized I was holding, embarrassment flooding through me alongside the relief. "I heard footsteps," I admitted. "I thought it might be someone else. After everything that's happened, I suppose I'm more on edge than I realized." He crossed the room and sat across from me, his expression softening in a way that had become increasingly familiar over the past several days. "You have every right to be on edge," he said. "I should not have let this situation reach the point where you're afraid to work late in your own office." "It's not your fault," I said. "It is," he said quietly. "I brought you into this world without giving you the choice to fully understand what you were walking into. Whatever happens from here, I intend to make certain you're protected, whatever that requires of me." Something in his voice carried a weight beyond simple professional obligation, and sitting there in the quiet office with the city lights glittering faintly beyond the windows, I allowed myself to acknowledge something I had been avoiding since the very first day I met him. This was no longer only about a photograph or a mystery connecting our families. Somewhere along the way, without either of us intending it, something else had begun growing between us. Fragile and uncertain, but undeniably real. "I don't regret coming back," I told him, "even knowing everything I know now." He held my gaze for a long moment, and in that silence, I understood that whatever answers waited for us about our mothers, about the photograph, about the enemies circling somewhere beyond these walls, we would face them together now, whether either of us had planned for that outcome or not. The paper shook slightly in my hand as I laid it flat on Damon's desk the following morning, my heart pounding harder than it had during the gunfire 2 days earlier, because somehow this quiet piece of evidence felt more dangerous than any bullet. "What is this?" he asked, leaning forward to study the faded handwriting. "I found it hidden inside the box my mother kept the photograph in," I said. "There's a false bottom I never noticed before. Those initials appear 3 times. D.G. I couldn't stop thinking about the name you mentioned yesterday." Damon went very still, his eyes fixed on the page like it might vanish if he looked away. "Grantham," he said quietly. "I don't know for certain," I admitted, "but the timing feels like too strange a coincidence to ignore." He picked up the paper carefully, turning it toward the window light to examine the ink more closely, and I watched his expression shift through several emotions in rapid succession, confusion giving way to something sharper, something that looked almost like recognition. "These dates," he said slowly. "They match almost exactly with entries in my father's old ledgers. I've read through those records more times than I can count over the years, searching for anything that might explain my mother's disappearance. I never once connected them to a set of initials belonging to someone outside our organization." "What does it mean?" I asked. He set the paper down and looked at me directly, and for a moment, I saw something in his expression that resembled fear, an emotion I would not have believed a man like him capable of showing so openly. "I think your mother knew things about my family that she was never supposed to know," he said. "I think whatever she knew may be connected to why my mother disappeared, and possibly why your mother spent the rest of her life hiding you both from a world she clearly understood far better than she ever admitted." The idea settled over me slowly, cold and strange, reshaping every memory I carried of my careful, quiet mother into something I no longer fully recognized. She had told me almost nothing about her life before I was born, deflecting every question with practiced ease, and I had always assumed her secrecy came from simple grief over a difficult past, nothing more. Now I wondered whether that secrecy had been protection instead, a wall built deliberately to keep me safe from something she understood far better than she ever let on. "We need to know more," I said. "About Grantham, about whatever connection exists between our mothers." Damon nodded slowly, already reaching for his phone to summon Nolan into the office, and within the hour, the three of us sat together poring over old records pulled from a locked archive I had not known existed on a lower floor of the building, ledgers and letters and photographs spanning nearly 30 years of history I had walked into blindly only 2 weeks earlier. The picture that emerged over the following hours was more complicated and more painful than I had expected. Grantham, it turned out, had not always been an enemy of Damon's family. Decades earlier, he had worked alongside Damon's father as a trusted partner, the two men building their respective territories in careful cooperation rather than open conflict. Something had shifted between them roughly 26 years earlier, around the exact time of Damon's mother's disappearance, though the old records offered only fragments of what that shift had actually involved. "There was a woman," Nolan said eventually, reading from a brittle page covered in handwriting none of us immediately recognized. Referenced only as M throughout these later entries, it seems she worked as an intermediary between the two organizations, someone trusted enough to carry sensitive information between your father and Grantham during a particularly volatile period. "M," I repeated. "Could that be Mary Ann, my mother?" Nolan looked up slowly, his expression grave. "It's possible," he said. "If your mother worked as an intermediary during that period, she may have witnessed something that led directly to the breakdown between your father and Grantham, something significant enough to end their partnership entirely and turn two former allies into bitter rivals." Damon had gone quiet beside me, his eyes fixed on the old ledger like it might rearrange itself into a clearer answer if he stared long enough. "This means your mother may have known exactly what happened to mine," he said finally, his voice low and controlled in the way I had learned meant he was holding back something far more intense underneath. "She may have witnessed it directly." I felt sick at the thought, imagining my quiet, gentle mother standing somewhere in the middle of a conflict this dangerous, carrying secrets heavy enough to reshape the rest of her life in silence and isolation. "If she saw something happen to your mother," I said slowly, working through the logic even as it formed, "that would explain why she disappeared from whatever life she had before I was born, why she never spoke about it, why she kept that photograph hidden instead of simply throwing it away." "She was protecting herself," Damon said, "and protecting you." We spent the remainder of that day searching through every remaining document in the archive, piecing together a timeline that grew more disturbing with each new detail uncovered. It became increasingly clear that the breakdown between Grantham and Damon's father had not been a simple business disagreement, but something far more personal, something involving accusations of betrayal serious enough that violence had followed almost immediately afterward. Damon's mother vanished within weeks of that breakdown. Around the same time, according to a handful of scattered records Nolan managed to locate, a woman matching Mary Ann's approximate age and description had quietly left the city entirely, resurfacing months later in a different state, under circumstances none of the old records explained clearly. "She ran," I said quietly, staring at the fragmented timeline laid out across Damon's desk. "She witnessed something, and then she ran, and she spent the rest of her life making sure nobody ever found her again. Which means Grantham may have spent decades believing she was either dead or permanently silenced," Damon said. "If he discovers she had a daughter who recently surfaced inside my organization, carrying evidence connected directly to whatever happened all those years ago, he may see you as a threat serious enough to act against directly." The fear that settled through me at those words felt different from the terror I experienced during the attack in the parking garage. Quieter, but somehow more suffocating. The fear of becoming a target, not through random chance, but through deliberate, calculated intention. "What do we do?" I asked. Damon reached across the desk and took my hand, a gesture that surprised me with its gentleness, given everything surrounding us in that moment. "We find him before he finds you," he said. "And we find out exactly what my mother witnessed, so that whatever happens next, it happens because we chose it, not because we were forced into hiding, the way both our mothers were forced into hiding decades ago." I held on to that certainty through the following days, as Nolan's men worked quietly to locate any current trace of Grantham's operations within the city, and as Damon grew increasingly protective in ways that felt less like professional obligation and more like something he could no longer fully hide, walking me to my apartment personally rather than leaving the task entirely to Priya, calling in the evenings to check that I had arrived home safely, finding small excuses throughout each day to remain near my desk longer than any reasonable task required. On the third night of searching, I woke suddenly to the sound of my phone buzzing against the nightstand, and Priya's voice on the other end carried an urgency that pulled me fully awake within seconds. "Someone tried to access your building's records tonight," she said. "A woman claiming to be a distant relative, asking questions about your mother at the front desk of your old apartment complex. The staff grew suspicious and turned her away, but Damon wanted you informed immediately." My hands trembled as I sat up in the darkness of my bedroom. "Did they get anything?" I asked. "Nothing," Priya said. "But it confirms what we feared. Someone is actively searching for information about your family, and they're moving quickly now that they suspect you might be connected to whatever happened decades ago." I did not sleep again that night, sitting instead at my kitchen table with every light in the apartment switched on, staring at the small wooden box that had once felt like nothing more than a sentimental keepsake, and now felt like the center of a danger I could not fully measure. When Damon arrived at my door before sunrise, dark circles beneath his eyes, suggesting he had slept no better than I had, I found myself relieved beyond words, simply to see his face. "I'm moving you into secured housing today," he said, without preamble. "Not as a suggestion. Grantham's people are getting bolder, and I won't risk your safety on the chance that my usual arrangements are enough to protect you." I did not argue, though the idea of abandoning my apartment, small and imperfect as it was, still carried a sting of loss I had not expected. It had been the last place my mother ever visited before her illness worsened beyond recovery, and leaving it felt like severing one more thread connecting me to a life I understood, however painful that life had sometimes been. The secured housing turned out to be a quiet apartment within the same building where Damon lived, several floors below his own residence, guarded around the clock by men I recognized now as some of the most trusted members of his organization. I settled in quickly, though sleep remained difficult, every unfamiliar sound in the new space pulling me instantly awake, heart pounding, until exhaustion finally overcame vigilance, somewhere near dawn each night. Damon visited often during those days, sometimes with updates on Nolan's search, sometimes simply to sit with me in silence while I worked through the fear that had settled permanently into my chest since the warning about my old apartment complex. I found myself grateful for his presence, in ways that went beyond simple safety, grateful for someone who understood exactly what weight I carried, without requiring lengthy explanation. "You don't have to stay every evening," I told him once, though I did not entirely mean it, some part of me hoping he would ignore the suggestion. "I know," he said, settling into the chair across from where I sat curled on the small sofa. "I choose to anyway." "Why?" I asked, though I suspected I already understood the answer forming behind his careful eyes. "Because for the first time since my mother disappeared," he said slowly, "I've found someone who understands exactly what that loss feels like, without needing it explained to them in detail. I'm not willing to lose that understanding, simply because staying close carries risk. Everything worth protecting in my life has always carried risk, Elena. I stopped letting that stop me a long time ago." I did not respond immediately, the weight of his words settling into the same quiet space where fear and hope had been wrestling for control since the moment I first walked into his office. Instead, I reached across the distance between us and took his hand, holding it firmly enough that he could not mistake the gesture for anything less than what it was. "We'll get through this," I said, "together. He held my gaze for a long moment, something raw and unguarded passing behind his careful eyes. Together, he agreed. Nolan noticed, as he always did, though this time he did not warn me away from the growing closeness between us. Instead, catching me alone near the break room one afternoon, he simply studied me for a long moment before speaking. "I've known Damon since he was barely older than you are now," he said. "I watched his father search for answers about his wife for years, watched that search slowly consume him until there was almost nothing left of the man he used to be before she disappeared. I always feared Damon would follow the same path, carrying that same unfinished grief, until it hollowed him out entirely." "What are you telling me?" I asked. "I'm telling you that whatever this is between you," he said, gesturing vaguely between us, "it's already changed him more in 2 weeks than anything has in over a decade. Be careful with that, not because it's dangerous to you, because I think it might be the only thing capable of pulling him back from the same fate his father suffered." I thought about those words for the rest of the day, turning them over alongside everything else I had learned, and that evening, when Damon appeared at my apartment door earlier than usual, something in his expression told me the search for Grantham had finally produced a result neither of us was fully prepared for. "We found him," Damon said. "He's been operating out of a shipping warehouse on the eastern edge of the city for years, quiet enough that my father never located it during his own search. Nolan confirmed it this afternoon." "What do we do now?" I asked, though some part of me already suspected the answer would require more courage than I had ever been asked to summon in my entire life. "Now we go get the truth directly from the man who has spent 26 years hiding it," Damon said. "And we make certain that whatever happened to our mothers, it does not happen to us as well." The warehouse loomed against the night sky, like something built to be forgotten, all rusted metal and shattered windows, the kind of place a man could hide inside for decades, if he had enough money and enough fear working in his favor to keep people from looking too closely. "I should not have come," Damon told me for the third time as our car slowed to a stop half a block away, the engine idling quietly in the darkness. "You need someone who can recognize your mother's face, if we find any trace of her here," I said. "That's me. I'm not staying behind." He did not argue further, though the tension in his jaw told me exactly how much this decision cost him. Nolan sat in the front seat, checking a small earpiece connected to the 6 men Damon had positioned quietly around the perimeter of the building, men trained to move without drawing attention, to secure a location before anyone inside understood they had been found. 2 days earlier, Nolan had come to Damon's office with a warning that nearly ended this entire plan before it began. "Grantham's people have noticed our surveillance," he said. "If we wait much longer, he may relocate entirely, and we could lose any chance of finding him again for years." "Then we move now," Damon had said, and the following 48 hours passed in a blur of preparation, careful mapping of the warehouse location, quiet coordination between men who had spent their careers avoiding exactly this kind of direct confrontation. I spent those 2 days torn between terror and a strange, steady resolve that surprised even me, packing a small bag in case we needed to leave the city quickly, reviewing every detail Nolan's team had gathered about the building's entrances and exits, until I could have drawn the layout from memory alone. Priya had argued fiercely against my presence during the confrontation itself, insisting that Damon's men could handle the situation without exposing me to unnecessary risk. "I understand the danger," I had told her, standing in the small kitchen of my secured apartment while she paced in frustration. "But I've spent my entire life not knowing the truth about my own family. I'm not staying behind now, not when we're finally close enough to touch it." She had relented eventually, though only after securing a promise from Damon that I would remain surrounded by armed protection at every moment inside the warehouse. A promise he repeated to me again as our car finally approached the looming structure ahead. "If I tell you to run," he said quietly, his eyes fixed on the darkened building through the windshield, "you run immediately. No hesitation, no arguing. Do you understand me?" "I understand," I said, though privately I doubted my ability to leave his side under any circumstance, a stubbornness I recognized in myself, but chose not to voice aloud in that tense, quiet moment. "Stay close to me," Damon said, opening the car door. "Whatever happens, do not wander from my side." I nodded, my pulse hammering so hard I could feel it in my fingertips, As we crossed the empty lot toward a side entrance, Nolan's men had already confirmed was unguarded. The warehouse interior smelled of rust and old oil, shadows stretching long across stacked crates that had clearly sat undisturbed for years. And somewhere deeper inside, a single light burned faintly, drawing us forward through the darkness, like a signal meant only for us. We found Grantham seated alone at a small metal desk near the back of the warehouse, an older man with gray hair and tired eyes who looked up slowly as we approached, showing no surprise at all, as though he had been expecting this exact moment for years. "Damon Kessler," he said, his voice rough with age but steady. "I wondered how long it would take you." "You knew we were coming," Damon said, his hand resting near the weapon holstered beneath his jacket, though he made no move to draw it. "I knew the moment my people reported a young woman matching Marianne's description working in your building," Grantham said, his eyes shifting to me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. "You look exactly like her. It's almost unsettling." "You knew my mother," I said, forcing steadiness into my voice despite the fear coiling tightly in my chest. "I knew her very well," Grantham said, "better than either of you probably understand." "Tell us what happened to my mother," Damon said, his voice sharp enough to cut through the quiet warehouse air. 26 years of searching ends tonight, one way or another." Grantham studied him for a long moment, then gestured toward 2 folding chairs positioned across from his desk, an invitation neither of us fully trusted, but chose to accept anyway, understanding that the truth we had searched for would not come easily or without cost. "Your father and I built something valuable together," Grantham began, once we sat, "a careful balance that kept this city stable for both our organizations far longer than either of us expected. Your mother worked as our intermediary during the final years of that partnership, carrying information between us that neither of us trusted to less discreet hands. She was clever, careful, exactly the kind of person that arrangement required." "What went wrong?" Damon asked. "Your father grew suspicious that I was planning to expand into territory we had agreed belonged to him," Grantham said. "He was wrong, but by the time I understood the depth of his suspicion, the damage had already been done. He believed your mother had betrayed him, feeding me information that would help me move against him. She had not, but belief, once it takes root in a man like your father, is difficult to uproot with simple denial. He threatened her," Damon said quietly, something dark moving behind his eyes. "He did far worse than threaten her," Grantham said, his own expression darkening with old, unresolved guilt. "I tried to warn her. I sent word that your father intended to remove her permanently, believing it would protect his organization from further exposure. She fled that same night, taking nothing with her except whatever she could carry, disappearing before his men arrived to carry out his order." The room seemed to tilt slightly around me, as the pieces finally aligned into a shape too painful to fully absorb. "My father ordered her killed," Damon said, his voice barely above a whisper. "He believed it necessary," Grantham said. "I have carried the guilt of that warning for 26 years, wondering whether I saved her life or simply delayed an inevitable end. I searched for her myself for years afterward, hoping to confirm she had survived, but she vanished too completely for even my resources to trace." "She changed her name," I said, my voice shaking now despite every effort to remain steady. "She built an entirely different life. She had me, and she never told me any of this. Not one single piece of it. She was protecting you," Grantham said gently, looking at me with something that resembled genuine sympathy. "If your father's organization ever discovered she survived, and that she had a daughter, that daughter would have become a target the moment anyone made the connection. She buried that history so completely that even I lost her trail within the first year." Damon sat in silence for a long moment, processing a truth that reshaped everything he had believed about his own father, about the decades of searching that had consumed his father's final years, about a version of history he had trusted completely until this exact moment. "My father spent his life searching for a woman he had ordered killed," Damon said finally, the words heavy with a grief that seemed to reach all the way back through his entire childhood. "He never told me the truth. He let me believe he simply lost her, that some enemy took her from us, when the entire time, he was the danger she ran from." "I'm sorry," Grantham said, and for the first time since we arrived, his voice carried genuine emotion, rather than careful calculation. I should have told you years ago, when you first took control of your father's organization. I was afraid of how you might react, afraid the truth might reignite a conflict this city has already suffered enough from. Where is she now? I asked. My mother said she never told me anything about her past before I was born. Is there any chance your mother and my mother remained in contact after she fled? Any chance she knows more than what's written on that page I found? Grantham's expression shifted, something uncertain passing behind his tired eyes. There was a woman who reached out to me nearly 10 years ago, he said slowly. She never gave a full name, only asked whether Marianne Voss had ever been found, whether it was safe for someone connected to her to resurface. I told her what I knew, which was very little, and I never heard from her again. I always wondered if that call came from Marianne herself, checking whether the danger had finally passed. My mother was already sick by then, I said quietly, doing the mathematics in my mind, matching timelines against illness, against the quiet, careful life she had built for the two of us. She must have been trying to find a way back to whatever life she'd left behind, trying to decide if it was finally safe to tell me the truth, before she ran out of time to do it herself. She ran out of time before she found her answer, Damon said gently, reaching for my hand. We sat with Grantham for nearly an hour longer, filling in fragments of a history that had shaped both our families in ways neither of us had ever fully understood, and by the time we finally rose to leave, something had shifted permanently between the three of us, an old, painful conflict finally given the resolution it had been denied for over 2 decades. I won't pursue territory that belongs to your organization, Grantham told Damon, as we prepared to leave. I never wanted this conflict to continue into another generation. If you're willing to let the old grievances end here, I am as well. Damon studied him for a long moment, weighing decades of inherited suspicion against the raw honesty of the man sitting before him. My father built an empire on secrets and violence, he said finally. I don't intend to inherit his mistakes along with his territory. Let this end here. We drove back through the quiet city in silence, the weight of everything we had learned settling slowly over both of us. And when we finally arrived back at the building where I had first walked in searching for nothing more than an ordinary job, Damon turned to face me in the dim interior of the car. I owe you an apology, he said. I brought you into danger you never asked for, all because of a photograph that fell out of your bag on your very first day here. I don't regret any of it, I said, and I meant it completely, despite everything we had survived to reach this moment. I finally understand my mother. I finally understand why she protected me the way she did, and I found something else along the way that I never expected to find at all. What's that? He asked quietly. You, I said simply. He reached up and brushed a strand of hair away from my face, his hand lingering gently against my cheek. My mother never got the chance to build a life beyond fear, he said. Your mother spent her final years hiding instead of living freely. I don't intend to repeat their mistakes. Whatever this is between us, I want to build it honestly, in the open, without secrets standing between us, the way they stood between our parents. 3 weeks later, standing in front of the entire staff of the building where I had once walked in desperate and afraid, Damon took my hand publicly for the first time, announcing changes to the organization that would move it steadily away from the shadows his father had always operated within, and introducing me not as an employee, but as the woman standing beside him through whatever future came next. The photograph that started everything now sat framed on his desk rather than hidden inside a locked drawer, a quiet reminder of 2 women who had spent their lives running from a truth their children finally uncovered and refused to bury again. I walked into that office searching only for a job to keep myself afloat during the hardest months of my life. I found something far larger instead, a truth buried for 26 years, a connection neither of us could have predicted, and a future built openly on honesty rather than secrecy, the very thing our mothers had never been given the chance to have. Some doors, once opened, change everything that comes after them. Mine changed everything, the moment an old photograph fell out of my bag and landed at the feet of a man who never stopped searching for the truth. In the months that followed, I learned to live inside a world I never expected to belong to, slowly understanding the careful balance Damon maintained to keep the people around him safe, and watching him gradually loosen his grip on the harsher methods his father had once relied upon. He was not a perfect man, and the world he had inherited was not one that transformed overnight simply because two old enemies had finally chosen peace over further bloodshed. But every day, I watched him choose honesty over concealment, choose partnership over control. Small decisions that slowly reshaped the organization he led into something his father never managed to build. Nolan remained a constant presence throughout those changes, occasionally reminding me with a dry, knowing look that he had warned me from the very beginning how deeply I would come to matter to the man he had protected since childhood. I never told him he had been right, though I suspect he knew it regardless, the same way he seemed to know almost everything before anyone else around him. I visited my mother's grave one final time that spring, kneeling in the quiet grass with the photograph in hand, finally able to say the words I had spent months searching for. "I understand now," I told her, though I knew she could not hear me, though I knew the words came far too late to ease whatever fear had haunted her final years. "I understand why you never told me, and I forgive you for carrying it alone, instead of trusting me with the truth. I only wish you had lived long enough to see how it finally ended." Grantham kept his word about the peace between our territories, and over time, an unlikely friendship formed between him and Damon, built slowly on the shared grief of two families torn apart by the same violent history. He visited occasionally, always bringing some small fragment of memory about my mother that he had somehow overlooked during our first conversation, small kindnesses that helped me piece together a fuller picture of the woman she had been before fear reshaped her entire life. Damon proposed to me on the same rooftop where his mother used to bring him as a child, before everything fell apart, a place he told me he had never once returned to until that evening. "I want to build something here that neither of our mothers ever got the chance to have," he said, kneeling with a small ring that had belonged to his grandmother. "A life without hiding, a life we choose together, in the open, for as long as we both live." I said yes without a single moment of hesitation, standing on that rooftop with the entire city stretched out glittering beneath us, thinking of two women who had once been forced into silence and fear, and of the daughter and son who had finally, after 26 long years, given their mother's story the ending it always deserved. Some doors, once opened, change everything that comes after them. Mine changed everything the moment an old photograph fell out of my bag and landed at the feet of a man who never stopped searching for the truth. And together, we finally closed the door on the fear that had shaped both our families for far too long.